Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our exclusive podcast for patrons and Subscribe Star subscribers. My name is Mike.
What do you call them? We need to call them something.
I know. It's like...
Stars?
What? It's like Patreon, you have patrons. Subscribe Star, you have subscribers, I would guess. Subscribe Studs, I like that. That's good.
Yeah, that sounds cool, but Subscribe Studs is pretty good.
It works out. We've pulled a few questions from you guys to talk about some really good, thoughtful stuff, as usual. We're going to start with Will Mullet. Says, would you guys say that the intersection between literature and video games is more fertile than that between the latter and film? So essentially, literature to video games more so than literature to film. I would cite the centrality of video games as a plot device in acclaimed novels such as The Three-Body Problem and Ready Player One, and the glaring example of the Witcher franchise. Contrast these against ill-reputed video game film adaptations such as Prince of Persia and the Resident Evil series. A counter-argument might cite the influence of cinema on titles like Uncharted and the success of the game based on Ratchet and Clank, the Ratchet and Clank movie. Although maybe the creative membrane only brooks positive influence on video games when concerning film, not from asymmetric to the symbiosis between games and literature. So, if I'm to boil this down, it sounds like Will thinks literature would be better adapted to a game. A lot of literature would be, rather than it being adapted to a film. Let me read this first one again, just to make sure that I got that right. The intersection between literature and video games, is more fertile than that between literature and film. Yeah, the latter and film. So, do we think that a book, a novel, could be adapted to a video game easier than a book being adapted into a movie? I think is what he's saying.
Yeah, in some ways I do agree with that. I mean, I don't know, because I know I've seen a ton of video game to movie or book to movie adaptations, and the book tends to be the better product between the two. But I have not seen a ton of book to video game adaptations. Something interesting about video games, though, is that it is a very text-heavy medium in general. At least that's where it came from. I know you still have voice acting, but for the most part, even with voice acting games, it's always supplementarily subtitled, right? So even in games like The Witcher or something, you're hearing people talking, but you're also reading it. They don't do that with movies, right? You just hear it, and if you didn't get it, then that's too bad. And that's partly because video games passed, that it was all words, right? There was no voice acting. You were just reading things on a screen. Film did that, but to a way lesser degree with the silent films. They would have one little intermittent subtitle every, 10 minutes or so. It was not nearly like what it is with video games. And so video games being primarily a text read experience, just in general, it does make sense that they can adapt the literature probably better than films can. But also the pacing is kind of up to the player and how they want to go about things. And there's that added element within a video game of your own imagination, just like reading a book. When you're playing a game, specifically, once again, referencing the older games, the experience in your mind is not necessarily the experience that was being presented to you via the game creators. It is a creation within your mind, specifically with the pixel art, that you decided how it looked and how it felt and how things unfolded. The game didn't necessarily feed that to you. Nowadays, it does more so. And so you're losing a lot of that literary element that is what makes books so enjoyable. And you're losing that to a more passive film-like experience that probably is not as easily adapted to a video game or from a book.
Yeah.
the future of video games. Because even with the example of The Witcher, I have not played these games so much, but how much do the Witcher games follow those books?
Well, that's what I was going to bring up.
Because my
Is
understanding is not as much, right? Just little bits here and there and elements.
the stories? Well, they're totally different stories. So the video games take place after
Yeah,
the novels. So it's like many, many years later, after the novel series is over, that's when the video games start. And I think that there's a very good reason for that. And it's because they could not have adapted the stories of the novels into a video game. Because the novels are very much, the conflict is all in the dialogue and the characters going back and forth and sort of like debating philosophy. And like, that's not to say that there's no action. Of course, there's
true.
action in them. But like, The Last Wish, for instance, is just a lot of scenes where two people sit down and talk. And it's fascinating what they talk about and what they debate, and seeing how those characters interact with each other is what makes it so great. But you can't really make a good video game out of that. There's
No,
not
that would
a
be
whole
hard.
lot. There's not a whole lot of, Geralt just wandering around doing monster hunts in those stories, right? It's like
Yeah,
it's implicit that he does that when we're not following him. So it's like
yes,
we're here with him now during some scene where he's talking with Yennefer or he's talking with this person or that person. But like when we're not with him, obviously he's out in the world doing stuff that we would be doing in the video game version of The Witcher. But
yeah.
so I feel like there's a strong reason why they didn't try to just straight up adapt the novels into the games, because those stories don't work as games.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So, I mean, in that sense, and that is generally the case, right? That's why based on what you just said, it sounds like The Witcher would best be suited to something more akin to like what Game of Thrones, the television series, ended up being, especially in that. I mean, it is mostly just people talking, but that is way hard to do in a video game. Like we've
Yeah.
talked about this on the last podcast, but Project Triangle Strategy does a lot of this kind of stuff where it's different scenes and people talking and you're
Mhm.
strategizing, you're figuring things out. A lot of the game is in between battles as opposed to the battles being the game. Um, and it is a little tiring to just be having your game experience be mostly reading text.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like there's value there for sure, but it feels different. It doesn't convey it the way that literature does.
Yeah. And I do think that that's probably the biggest problem with trying to adapt any kind of, like, I'm trying to think of novels that I've read where they would like they could be turned into good video games. I feel like it's hard because novels
Yeah.
novels generally are exploring the thoughts of characters, and
Yeah, totally.
characters like you spend a lot of time with characters in more of the mundane situations as we get to like really understand who they are, right?
Yeah.
Book pacing is generally a lot slower than film pacing or game pacing or something like that, and you can have long stretches where there's no action. It's a very different medium with very different expectations, and so I'm actually not sure that I would agree that literature is more suited to be adapted to video games than films are. I just think that thus far, in fact, I think films would probably, well, it depends on the movie, but there's more of the type of movie, the action movies, the big epics, that would be suited for like gameplay that people expect, the combat and like that sort of thing. Um,
Yeah.
Whereas I don't know, like there's definitely, I don't want to say that definitively though, because I think something like Mistborn could probably make a very good video
Uh,
game,
yeah.
but it's probably because the author grew up with video games, right? So it's like you have like this younger generation of people who grew up with video games and had that influence on them. And you'll start to see the way they think about writing a novel, or the way they think about systems, whether it's magic systems or how a world works, that like can sort of fit well into like a game in ways that maybe you wouldn't have seen sort of that crossover from, novelists 50 or 60 years ago. So I think there's probably just some examples you could find that would be really well suited, and a lot of them that wouldn't be. And you just kind of have to pick and choose. Like, and I think on top of that, though, it's like even if this particular story doesn't work as a game, the world could still have a story in it that would, right? So rather than like, I don't know, The Legend of Zelda, you could probably write like a really deep character-driven novel that takes place in that world or something that wouldn't follow like one of the video game stories necessarily. Like when we were thinking about doing a live action feature film for Zelda, it wasn't going to be an adaptation of one of the game stories. It was going to be an original story, sort of extrapolating.
On, like, some text, something that was just hinted at, not even like a really bad, so that would give us more freedom to kind of do what we wanted.
Yeah. So it's a hard question to answer, and I don't think there's like really necessarily a perfect answer to this, but I do think that games require, or because there are some games we talk about, like the old Telltale Walking Dead series, and they did a Game of Thrones one as well. So those are just more text adventure almost. It's like an offshoot of that. It's a point and click adventure game. That could probably be a good game, if you want to call it that, for a novel adaptation, because a lot of that is just dialogue trees and talking to people and walking around looking at stuff. So, I mean, but for like what we usually tend to think of games as, the really big AAA experiences that sort of require a lot of player feedback, player moving, player exploring, player solving, player platforming or fighting or something like that. I actually can't think of that many novels that would actually work. Like The Lord of the Rings, there's been so many games made based on The Lord of the Rings, and none of them are good.
No.
And none of them really follow the stories that well.
No, they don't, because they can't, because those stories are not suited for a video game.
Yeah. So I actually think that film is
understandably so, but whatever they do with them isn't really any better, I wouldn't say.
Yeah. I think that film is better suited for an adaptation from literature, but it's not perfectly suited, right? It's not probably as well suited as a television series, which is pretty much the way the industry is moving now. The film industry, everything needs to be turned into a series that you can stream on Disney Plus or Netflix or something like that, right? Like even the big studios, Marvel, are doing that now, right? Like they have all their shows that they're like the Captain America, or what is it, Falcon and Winter Soldier, and Star Wars with Mandalorian, and so it seems to be moving that direction because you can. Well, I think it's probably a little bit less expensive because the expectation isn't quite the same for like the sort of constant action and visual effects, right? You can kind of slow down a little bit. But I think people just enjoy following a character for a longer period of time, really getting to know them better. That's the constraint of film that it doesn't fulfill as well.
Right. So I guess that's the missing link here. Instead of saying which one between films and video games is more suited for literature, the TV series would likely actually end up being the better option between the two. So neither of them, neither a film with its 2-hour limit and its action focus and what a film can do and its broad appeal, versus a TV show, which can have a way more focused, narrow appeal, and it's not as expensive. And You can have what? Because my thought is for Game of Thrones, with how much just talking there is, Game of Thrones may not have actually made, even if you made it into 10 movies, like it's better suited as a TV show. Now that's true of a lot of I think of a lot of like anime and stuff as well. When I think of this, there's just so much you can do with a TV show that films cannot and never will be able to do. And with a video game, it would just be too boring. If you could come up with some kind of gameplay that is different from what they've come up to so far
Mm-hmm.
and what they've been able to come up with, then maybe you could have something like just like a normal, like a Harry Potter or something, and just be able to adapt it faithfully. That's the key point, faithfully into a video game. But at the moment, it's like, what would that gameplay look like? You'd just be walking around, going to school, and maybe once a month you stumble onto something that leads to some sort of mystery. It's not.
Yeah.
It's too adjacent to real life. Literature is too close to real life to be an engaging video game at all.
Yeah, I agree. It's a good question, Will, and hopefully it's an answer that's sufficient, but it's tough because I don't know. It's just
it depends on the book. It really depends on the book.
Yeah, it totally depends. This next one comes from Jason from Subscribestar. This is one we've talked about before, but I figured we'd go at it again a little bit. What do you feel about RPG gameplay length these days? I have a hard time with RPGs more than 35, 40 hours. 100-plus hour game is just too long. I feel like the community wants longer and longer games. This is true that there is, to some extent, pressure or an expectation from the audience that when I buy an RPG, my $60, $70, whatever it is, it better get me this many hours of content. And a lot of times I feel like developers, it's not even I feel like this. I know that in the industry they have the lead devs will tell them, like, we have to have this much content in the game.
Yeah,
it has to equal this many
pressure.
hours.
Yeah.
It's almost like a marketing thing that they can say there's this many hours of gameplay in it, right? So
that's why we were so skeptical when Final Fantasy VII Remake was announced that it was only going to be in Midgar the whole game, but it was still going to somehow be a 60-hour game. Like that was like, are you kidding me? That's like a couple hours in the game, in the original game. You're just going to stretch it out just so that we feel like we got a full game. But what kind of content are you putting in there?
Yeah. And the answer was really, really long dungeons.
Yeah, just
really long dungeons. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I've been feeling more and more this way the older I get, where I have less and less tolerance or even time to invest more than, say, like 30-ish hours into a game. Aside from like what we are going to be looking at on the channel, like I'll replay Nier a bunch of times and that might end up equaling like 60, 70 hours.
Yeah, that'll end up adding up.
But that's going to go into content creation but like me just sitting down by myself and playing a game for 60 hours doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, that's hard. That's tough.
It's just a time issue, right? So
it would have to be like a big long awaited release or something, like Elder Scrolls 6 or something. It's like
something like that. Yeah.
Might get that one and it'll take 100 hours or whatever, but that's rare. That's very rare nowadays for me too,
Yeah, and it's like, even when we were growing up, though, I felt like games just were not that long. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that they had pretty hardcore limits on, like, the cartridge capacity, right? So, like, the RPGs on the Super Nintendo rarely ended up being, like, more than 40 or 50 hours long because, like, that cart just wasn't going to hold that much content in it.
Yeah.
But once the PlayStation hit, it was like, oh, now we can. And I actually remember reading I can't pull it up right now because I didn't expect that we would be talking about this, but there was, I think it was an interview with Kitase, Yoshinori Kitase. And he said that in a lot of ways, I think he was talking about like Final Fantasy VI, and like his time working on that game versus like the PlayStation ones. And he was saying how like he kind of missed the limitations of the Super Nintendo and the fact that it sort of made them really consider, does this need to be in the game or not? This thing that I want, this scene I'm attached to, this idea that I have, does it really have to be there? Because we have to make a choice about what we can and cannot include. And that made for tighter and more focused experiences than some of what they did thereafter, where they no longer had that limitation. They could kind of make the game, I don't want to say as long as they wanted to, but they could have multiple discs moving forward. And so, it didn't like dramatically increase the cost of printing and manufacturing the game, right? The way that multiple carts would, which never happened. You never saw a game package that had multiple carts in it, right? So,
I don't recall,
yeah. I think that became an expectation somewhere around the PS1, where it was like, oh yeah, these RPGs are going to be these 60, 70-hour long experiences. I'm getting so much value from the money that I spent on it versus, I don't know, something really, really short like Prince of Persia that's like you can beat it in like 6 hours or something, but it's the same upfront cost. Like, I get it from a consumer perspective, feeling like, well, if I'm going to spend my money and it's going to be this much either way, obviously I want the one that's going to entertain me longer. Like, that's intuitive. That makes sense.
It's almost a logical fallacy in your own mind that you convince yourself. Yeah.
Yes, it's exactly right.
Like
because rarely, I mean, very, very rarely have I found that the content that adds up past sort of just the main story content, which is almost always in that 20-hour range, right? You can beat the main story in 20 to 30 hours.
Yeah, if you don't know anything else. Yeah.
All this ancillary stuff around it. It's almost always really tedious, really repetitive. It's like 4 or 5 different types of quests that they just repeat over and over and over again with very slight variations on them. And generally I feel obligated to do them because I want to get the rewards for doing them. So like whether it's a really great piece of equipment or a really amazing summon, like have you really beaten or unlocking a different ending? Like, have you really beaten Final Fantasy VII? Like, can you really say that you got the full experience if you have not cast Knights of the Round? Like, if you didn't go through...
I was going to say, I don't know that I ever beat Ruby Weapon or Diamond Weapon. I don't know that I've ever, like, cared enough at the end of the game to do certain things, No.
Yeah, and it's like...
I probably have. I just can't remember.
As somebody who's going to go online and talk about games,
yeah,
there's a pressure. 100%. There's a pressure that I've got to try to get as close to seeing everything as possible because, like, I have to inform people about it, right? But that has never made me enjoy a game more. It's almost always made me enjoy it less. That's feeling obligated to do, the optional stuff, which is where all the padded length comes from.
Yeah.
But I don't feel like I'm actually getting the dollar value out of what I spent on that game. I already got it from the 20-hour experience that was directed and focused and, like, interesting.
Yeah.
So,
in fact, if you think of it in terms of an opportunity cost, your time would be better served moving on to play the core story of a different game than to squeeze every minute out of this current game. There's a diminishing return margin that you're just running up against once you play games for that long.
Yeah, I agree. So I'm all for RPGs returning back to the like the SNES sort of like structural length instead of like the Personas of the world. But
once again, this is a space where indie games have kind of filled pretty well. The indie games tend not to be that. I mean, some are very long, of course, but they tend not to be as long as, a lot of the RPGs and stuff that we see
Yeah.
coming out now. And so, that's good because they're cheaper and that's fine. But
Yeah.
if you're thinking of in terms of value based on minutes, then Stardew Valley would cost so much freaking money. Splatoon, Smash Brothers, like what are the games that I played that I have the most hours in? They're not necessarily my favorite games ever,
Yeah.
but they happen to be games that are geared towards repetitive play over and over and like mostly online stuff.
Yeah.
And like they're good games, they're fun, but it's like I wouldn't necessarily say that because I spent 100 hours playing Splatoon, but only 50 hours playing, I don't know, some other game, Golf Story. That was like 10 hours. That I
Yeah.
think Splatoon's is a more valuable. It has more value than Golf Story because I don't think
Yeah.
Golf
I don't
Story's
either.
sweet, by the way. You guys should play that.
I really like Golf Story. And yeah,
Good
it's
game,
like
great game.
about 10 hours.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know. It's like I agree with you. I think there's a bit of a logical fallacy going on where
Yeah.
people sort of try to equate minutes or hours played to like the dollar value of the cost of a brand new game. And
Yeah.
it's like it's not, it shouldn't be about that. It should be about like how I don't know the right term for it.
Well,
How much enjoyment did you get out of
yeah.
the base?
But that's hard to measure beforehand, before
Yeah, you
when you're
can't do
making the
that.
decision to buy the game. But nobody talks about this with movies, right? When
No.
Return of the King was in theaters and it was 3.5 hours long, the ticket for Return of the King cost the same as whatever rom-com was playing in the next theater over that's an hour and a half.
Yeah.
And people didn't have this debate that, oh, okay, I got more enjoyment out of this than the other than the fact that obviously Return of the King was going to be more enjoyable than whatever rom-com was playing next door. But if people wanted to go watch it, the ticket cost didn't matter. Nobody squabbled over whether or not like the value was well spent. It's just, you want to see this movie, I'll see that movie. And the massive time difference. In fact, I think movies are too long nowadays too. Like 3.5
Yeah.
hours is actually a long time to sit through something. I don't want movies to be that long, but nobody talks about this for movies. And I wonder if it's a marketing problem. It's a mistake within the industry that they're advertising the amount of hours and everyone's come to expect that. Whereas in movies, they never were like, this is how long it is. Although I think Return of the King did do that to some degree because they extended it and people just want
Yeah.
more, So I get
Want
that
more,
in
more,
some
more.
ways they'll use it to like advertise, but it's not an industry standard thing. People tend to not actually care about that.
Yeah.
And definitely don't think they didn't get their money's worth when the newest Marvel movie was only an hour and a half, even though it was really good. Like, who cares?
I'm trying to think about like if this applies to like page count or word count in like a
In a
novel
book.
too. Like I'm actually not sure if they charge more or less depending on like the length of a book. I don't
Bet you
think
longer
so.
books might be $1 or $2 more,
Yeah.
just based on printing costs. I'll bet you that's probably true, but I don't know. I don't know either, I guess.
But like a customer being like, "Oh, this
Oh,
book
the
is
value. I see what you're saying. Yeah,
this
yeah.
book is 600 pages and this book
And this
is
other one's 4.
200. I'm going to be able to read this one a lot more. I'll buy that one instead." Like
Well, you know what's interesting? I use Harry Potter as a reference for a lot of stuff, but one thing that I noticed back in high school when I first read those books is how short the first few books were, and then they
they're
gradually
really
get longer
short.
and longer. And the reason being is that people get older, and as she's writing them, she's writing them for the same audience as it grows up and can get read longer books. But after I read book 5, which is the longest book, book 6, when it came out, and I was in high school, so I was like, maybe I was comparing page count back, but that's because I'd never read a book that was that long before ever. So I was like, this is kind of cool.
Yeah.
I just read Harry Potter 5. It's like 600-700 pages long. Book 6 was shorter than book 5. Like by quite a bit, by at least
Yeah.
100 pages or more. It was quite a bit shorter. And I remember thinking about that. I prefer book 6 to book 5. In fact, I think that was one of the problems Rowling ran into. that by the time book 5 came out, which tends to be, I know you disagree on this one, but book 5 tends to be most people's least favorite book.
I haven't read it since I was 15 years old, so like my
Yeah,
opinion
but you
on
were
it was
saying that you liked the themes that it explored, that it was a little darker and a little more things went wrong more in book 5 than anywhere else, you know?
But my what I'm saying is that my opinion of it is based on being
an
removed for
okay.
17 years.
Well, I'm mostly talking about when I was about the same age too. But book 5, I think J.K. Rowling had too few limitations put on her, too few rules. The publishers weren't telling her what to do at this point. They were like, "You do what you want to do. We're just going to print and sell the book. Do it however you want." And the fact that book 6 ended up being so much shorter than book 5 makes me think, and this is pure speculation, but it makes me think that I don't know that book 5 sold maybe as well as they were expecting. Just total speculation, but I don't know any other reason why book 6 would have been shorter than book 5, other than someone, and it could even have been J.K. Rowling herself, intervened in her own process, or somebody intervened and said, "Hey, your books are getting too long. You're covering too much stuff that you don't need to talk about. The next one might need to be a little bit shorter so that you might need to constrain yourself so that you can kind of recapture, what was going on in those previous books that made people just love them so much." This is total speculation. Somebody's probably going to say that I'm totally wrong there, but I feel like there's something there. It's weird when a book that's gradually getting longer and longer and longer all of a sudden releases a new volume that's shorter. I feel like there's something there with the length and with people. You do get more value out of a shorter book. It doesn't have to be longer. Anyways, that's a tangent.
Well, I can say this as someone with just beginning the experience of publishing a novel, right?
Yeah.
So I finished mine in January, and I just got it back from my editor. So she's gone through her 500 pages of notes, and I have been going through and steadily like applying or making notes to call her back on, if I have further questions or I need clarification what she's saying or whatever. Anyways, I'm like about 65% of the way through that process. Mm-hmm. But one of the first things that she said to me in our first conversation before she really started editing was, "What is your word count?" And I said, "It's 135,000 words." And she's like, "That's really long for a first novel. We need to get that down a lot." So she hadn't even read the book yet, and she already wanted it to be closer to 100,000. She wanted to cut it by 35,000 words before even reading a single word of what I had written. So
that's from the marketing perspective.
Yes.
She's thinking about how best to sell the book. And people may not be willing to jump into something they've never gotten into before if it has that much of a time commitment.
Yes.
That's interesting.
I think that has to be the case. It seems, and I mean, I think the first Harry Potter is 76,000 words.
Whoa. Huh.
The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny, the first two Witcher novels that were published, they're under 100,000 words. But you do see the longer an author goes on, and they actually have like a fan base, and they're established and they have clout, they can get away with more and more and more every time. But there must be something to the fact that people are intimidated by really long books. I know that I am. And I really like to read. But I read all three Mistborn series, and I saw Stormlight Archive, The Way of Kings, the first book, and I was almost turned away by how long it is. It's just really, really big. And I still haven't finished it. I'm still just very slowly making my way through it a year into starting. So there definitely is something to that. There's something to the fact that sometimes it can be too long for its own good, even if the author or the creator is very well intentioned, and maybe the story does work for that length, But I think it's also very easy to get carried away into thinking you need all these details that you don't really need. And it's almost like an opposite thing. It's like in in the world of novels, they're trying to get them to cut back, but in the world of video games, they're trying to pad more. And maybe that's the industry not maturing enough yet. But like, it's weird to me that with games, the expectation right now for RPG players is pack it as full of content as possible. And then I feel like I'm getting my worth out of it. And for others, that's not necessarily the case. I don't know. Interesting thing to think about.
If the game Journey was a 60-hour game,
it would not be better.
It would be a lot worse. I can envision almost no possible world where that game is better being longer, significantly longer than it is.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
But they'd have been able to charge more for it, so I don't know.
That's true. Actually, that is true, because I think it was $20 or maybe $15 when it launched.
Yeah, and that's like a 3-hour game. That's like really, really short.
Yeah, you can beat it. You can beat it in 2 or 3 hours.
2 or 3. So I was also thinking too about other artists, that kind of have this similar situation. My initial thinking was to Tolkien and how he didn't really have to. So when Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings, it was one book, and the publisher told him, you need to split this up into multiple books to make it at least so that it's more approachable, right? But even then, that was based on him after having written The Hobbit, which is very short, relatively speaking, a very short book. And that's what got him the following to be able to do Lord of the Rings. But even then, the publisher more or less forced him to break up his one book into a bunch of others. One thing though about your book though, because you are planning on writing more of a series, right? Several others.
Is that a lot of
a lot of the details in the first book, if they can also be mentioned again in the next book, and you wouldn't miss anything, right? It's like, hey, wait to see if this one sells. And if you're talking about cities or countries or plants or peoples or anything, weapons that you can delve more deeper into in the next book, then maybe it would be best served just kind of waiting for that.
Wait. Instead of setting it up now.
Still gets it. Because if you think, no, it's important, they need to know this about the world, it's like, well, do they? And if they really want to, can they later? Maybe that's a different way to think about it.
I think that's a pretty good rule to follow is, because there's at least 1 or 2 setups that I have that don't get paid off in this novel. It's more like a setup for the series itself. But I know that those are going to be the first things, well, they're have been in some cases, that are like, this doesn't get paid off here, so consider cutting this or introducing it later, right? And anyway,
another thing comes to my mind is Twilight. So the first book is shorter, but not that much shorter than the other books. But you can tell that so much stuff was cut because in the first Twilight book, I don't think anyone here cares if I spoil Twilight, right? In the first Twilight book, based on what you saw in the trailers or whatever, I doubt most of you watched the movies, you would have thought that it's about a vampire competing against a werewolf for this girl's heart, right? But the first Twilight book, that werewolf dude is like not in it. He's in it like maybe a little bit, like less than 10% of the book is about him at all. And you don't even know that he's a werewolf. That doesn't even come up. It's not until the second book. And then they go into the 1,000-year-old history of the werewolves versus the vampires and their big battle. And, oh, this guy's a werewolf actually. And, oh, now there's a love triangle kind of thing. I would almost guarantee that Stephanie Meyer wanted that in her first book, and that it was like, you know what, this would be way better served being pushed back and wait until the next book for this kind of content. And who knows what it was, an editor or her. In my opinion, it doesn't matter because it's just the way the book industry is, right?
Yeah, it's part of the process.
Yeah.
All right. We have 2 here that are kind of touching on the same topic. First is from Eva Pilot Fair. Says, is the word of the creator always the sole decision as to what makes something canon and what doesn't? If no, what else makes a work canon other than the creator saying so? Now, Jonah the Man brings up a video from the Critical Drinker. Have you heard of the Critical Drinker?
I have. Yes, I
Yeah.
have. I've
It's
seen
good
some.
videos. So he recently put out a video called Why Canon Matters. I watched it. It's a great video. It makes a lot of really, really good points.
Good.
But he goes on to summarize, Jonah here, what the main point is. Says, the reason why canon is so important is because in-universe consistency helps to maintain the illusion that a fictional world is real, or more specifically believable, thereby facilitating the viewer's immersion. However, when a writer starts contradicting the established canon or retconning things at any point, it essentially pokes holes in the fictional world, and in doing so blurs the lines between canon and non-canon, to such an extent that the authority of said writer is reduced to that of an amateur fanfic author, hence why the term bad fan fiction is so often used on the internet to describe incongruous storytelling. The video struck me as highly profound, and it reminded me of the same problem that occurs when you start bringing characters back from the dead or adding time travel to a story. Nothing is at stake if there is no guarantee that the plot point will be of lasting consequences.
Yeah, it makes the world seem less real. Yeah.
I was just wondering what your thoughts were on it. So the video is great, and everybody should go watch it. Critical Drinker on YouTube, his latest video, Why Canon Matters. And it's actually a really intuitive point that I found to be so right, but which I hadn't really ever thought of in quite this way. Because I think a lot of people would default to the original creator, right? If you're one of those, you don't subscribe to the author is dead sort of like philosophy, right? It's like what the author thinks is important and we should consider it. That's the type of person I am. So I think a lot of those people would tend to default to the canon is whatever the creator says it is, right? They're the one in charge. You can't just have anybody adding anything to this, and because you're going to have too many inconsistencies and so forth. So, but then you have other people who are very much about author is dead and it belongs to the community now, and especially like say with Star Wars extended universe, all those novels and games and like, you know, a lot of that was considered canon, but like how you would parse what is and isn't between the bad and the good and people disagreeing on that, it could get really messy. So this essentially boils down to what actually I think or what would be most efficient to establish canon is whatever the rules were as they were introduced in early installments. So if you lay down a rule in, you know, entry 1 or 2, and that this is the way that this works, and we come to understand that this is how the world operates, I think that, even more so than the guy in charge of writing it or the person with the IP rights, who can at any time just decide to break those rules because they've run out of ideas or whatever else it might be. Oh, I didn't foresee that I actually wanted to do this with the story, and so now I have to break the rules of the world that the people fell in love with and accepted at the beginning, I think are more powerful in constituting canon than anything else. Because if that's what you've come to understand about how the world operates and how the consequences work, then that's what your expectation is that you're carrying into the next installment or the next entry. And when those are broken, you start to feel your immersion breaking. Like the illusion falls apart for you, and you realize you're sitting in your chair. You're not in the world. You're not with the characters. So I totally agree with that. Like, it's not about any one person or any group of people like getting to dictate what the canon is. It's what has been established in the world so far and what rules are there. Those tell us what is possible and what is not. And when this happens and it breaks that convention, then it's going to feel wrong. It's going to feel wrong for that world, and thus therefore wouldn't feel like it should belong or that it's canon. I think for me that's probably the best answer, or the one that I agree with the most.
I would agree with that now. I didn't used to. And that you may have like what you just said there may have that probably explains people's reaction to Star Wars Episode 8,
Mm-hmm.
the split, right? And that
Mm-hmm.
some people said, "Oh, if you just don't worry about the canon or whatever, it was a good movie, right? It was a fun movie." And then other people say that it can't be a good movie because of the canon that they
Right.
chose to kind of do whatever with. Um, so a long time ago, I used to be of the opinion that whatever the author said was the final word in
Yeah.
basically the canon in general. And I remember talking to Parker once. I can't remember if you were there or not. We were talking about Pan's Labyrinth, and Parker mentioned I can't even remember what it was. Parker's my brother, by the way, if
Yeah.
anyone knows. Mike and him are good friends too. Um, but I had mentioned that, oh, well, Guillermo del Toro said that this is what he meant by that scene. And so that's what that scene means, right? Is essentially what I was trying to tell my brother. My brother's a very artistically minded person, right? He's a deep thinker himself. And he was saying, no, I think it means this other thing because despite the artist's intent, there's more people working on the movie than just the artist. And
Sure.
despite what he felt like this means or the way he explained this whole thing, um, it would be better explained some other way, or there was some other thing that he was kind of latching onto. And it may have even been, and I can't remember what it was, but it may have even been an artistic, like there was the film spoke words metaphorically to my brother that
Oh,
then the director showed up and said, no, that's not what that scene's saying. But the experience of art is more than just the director putting things in your brain and now those things are in your brain now. Like art it's a two-way medium basically. Like your reactions to what you're seeing and what it means in your life based on your experiences they're going to vary from person to person, and especially from person to the person who made the whole thing in the first place. And Tree of Life is another good example of that kind of a movie where it can have very different what's happening in the mind of the audience via the art is very though it can be very different to what Terrence Malick was trying to convey himself, right?
yeah.
Although he did it masterfully in and of himself. But there's and this is I'm getting outside of lore right now, but I'm trying to make a point that I more or less really did agree that whenever the artist says something, that's just a fact, right? That's the fact, and that's how it is. And go ahead. And it was around maybe 10-ish years ago, or really, really around the time that 2015 when I saw Star Wars Episode 7, that it really solidified in my mind, like that once the death of the author, I move a little bit more towards that, just generally speaking.
Yeah.
That once the art is created and it's out there, it takes upon itself a different meaning. And I want to associate more with the original creator, but a work of art can be more perfect than the creator of the art could ever be.
Sure.
And so the art itself is going to be something that the artist can really screw up basically if they even though it's their own thing, right? And so when Disney bought Star Wars, I was like, what gives Disney the right to say that this is what happens next in the Star Wars universe, right? And at this point, I was still more staunchly on the side of whoever the artist, the original artist, creator, whatever he says goes, right?
Yeah.
And I was aware that George Lucas was not very much involved at all in the making of these new movies. And like, I was not happy that just because Disney had $4.5 billion, that they essentially paid for the privilege to decide what happened next
Yeah.
in the Star Wars canon. And I'm like, is that canon? No. Just because you have money, you get to alter canon. Like, canon is bigger than just like the words that it represents. Like, canon is is in the minds of everybody who's watching it. Canon, like you mentioned, it's the exposition of the world. It's what allows us to suspend our disbelief. You can't just say, "Oh, I have money. Here's my money. Now you guys will still maintain that same level of suspension of disbelief," right? Like, no, that's not how it works. Who cares that you have money and gave it to George Lucas, and now you're just dictating what happens in this thing that we love? Like, the money, like, we didn't get any of the money. We don't care. That doesn't matter to us at all. And so the fact that Disney gets to now dictate what is canon or not leads me to say that, yeah, they have the rights to legally, I guess, but like, they, in my opinion, they do not have the authority from me to continue George Lucas's work. And that's what they need. They didn't just need George Lucas's permission. They needed the permission of the audience to alter the canon, but they didn't seek for that. That is to say, they didn't get it, but they didn't even look for it. They just started making changes, doing what they wanted to do. Apparently, George Lucas had already written Episode 7 and gave them a script, and they took it and ripped it up and said, "Thanks, bye." And he was like, "Okay, you paid me a lot of money, so I guess I don't care." But I am now of more of the opinion that of the death of the artist, because you see that people like J.K. Rowling and how, you know, they loved her for how she would alter her own work after the fact before 10 years ago, but now that they don't like it so much when she talks about anything. And so things have changed so much, right? That it's like an artist can really just kind of get old and ruin their own work a lot. But I still hold like great value to J.R.R. Tolkien's letters that he wrote with like C.S. Lewis and others in regards to his work, like talking about the Blue Wizards and such, and what became of them. That's based on his letters. That's not necessarily based on like you know, the established stuff. But at the same time, he was still working on the Silmarillion. So he was still working on a work that was directly there at the time. I don't know. I would just say some artists are better at it than others. And probably the better practice would be to just practice in your mind the death of the author, unless you find an author that is just, oh my gosh, he's so on point and what he's saying does work with the story. So let's allow him to keep making changes after the fact.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, though, I didn't like it when George Lucas would make changes to his own work.
I didn't either.
Yeah, so George Lucas stepped in. He started making all sorts of changes to the new versions of the original trilogy. And it's like, you can't do that. Yeah, you made it, but you can't do that. But then when Disney made it, I was like, no, I want George Lucas to do it. Definitely not you. And now it's like multiple levels removed. So anyways, I think that's right. I think that's correct. That once the art's there, it means what it means, and the people connect it based on so that they can suspend disbelief. And just because the artist says something doesn't mean that it's going to work for everybody.
Yeah. Especially when it contradicts the rules that were established earlier.
So often it does.
Yeah.
And I feel like you said something about, oh, I can't do this thing within the confines that I set up, so I have to change my own rules.
Yeah.
Like, that's when you're kind of losing the art of it. Like, part of art is creating something within a frame, within boundaries, within a restricted space. And you can do whatever you want. You can be as artistically creative as you want, but keep it within this frame. You can't go outside the frame. There's rules. There's strict boundaries. And an artist that becomes really successful and wants to keep making art and is bored of the story they're telling, they want to tell a new story, right? They are of the mindset of break the boundaries, break the rules. And that's common for artists, because artists don't like to be contained. They don't like to be confined, and they don't like borders and boundaries, right? They want to explore all sorts of things. But you can't do that because you're dealing with the concrete when your work is being placed in front of somebody else, and you're expecting them to withhold disbelief.
Yeah, we kind of touched on this a little bit with FF8, right? It's like, it's a fantasy story. You can do whatever you want in a fantasy story. I've seen, right. I think I've seen it like at least 3 or 4 more people saying that in the comments of the podcast throughout. And I'm just like, can't wait till they see our response to that in the final video, if they make it that far. But
if they make it that far,
it's not about that, man. Like, you can't just do whatever you want and have it be accepted. Right. It has to follow the rules you've set up. And I think we didn't connect that to canon when we were talking about FF8, but I think it connects really well. It's
Yeah, it
like,
does.
regardless of what the author wants to do, if it breaks the conventions or the rules that he or she has already set up, then people won't accept it. So I think canon, what classifies as canon in the minds of the audience, is more or less usually about, does this fit with like what I believe can happen in this world? And what I believe can happen in this world is usually set up in entry 1 and 2 of the world. Like,
Early on.
it's not saying that you can't introduce more things later, but like they would still have to fit inside of the confines of those rules. Otherwise, you'll start to feel like, well, that can't happen in this, and then
You
that
know,
doesn't feel like canon anymore.
J.K. Rowling got so close to that when she introduced her Hermione's in book 3, her little time travel
The time
ticking thing,
traveling,
where it's like,
and it,
because of all the conflicts that take place after that, it's like, wouldn't it be nice to have that
if you
thing
could
that you
just
guys
use
used to
that
have?
again,
Where
yeah,
did it go?
exactly.
Oh, it conveniently got destroyed because it was too powerful. Oh, great. Okay. Good job.
Yep.
That's a little, she got so close to it, but people were willing to continue suspension of disbelief even after that because the way she pulled off book 3 was masterful and very well done.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Good question. Thank you for that one. Jonah and Eva Pilot. Okay, this next one is very quick from Edward Pinala. I just wanted to really quickly answer this because I'm not planning on making a video on it. What do you think of Fantasian?
I did watch some of your playthrough, by the way. Quite a bit of it, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
What did you think of it?
Oh, the visual presentation is absolutely fascinating. That start screen, like the opening shot where she's standing up on the building and it's just this like tech looking dystopian nightmare in front of her that's all sorts of neon colors and stuff.
So that, by the way, Leo, that character is a guy. It's not a girl. I know
sorry.
it looks a lot like a girl, but
I believe I got in my head that it was a girl early on, but I did know that it's a boy.
Okay.
But my gosh, the earrings and the hair and just everything. It just
eye makeup, like mascara,
and just general fare, the bone structure, just everything's just very, very feminine with that individual. So he, I thought that was what the game was going to be, like a cyberpunk-esque kind of that, like the color scheme of Hyper Light Drifter, kind of like, but that type of, world. And it's not. So that was a little disappointing. But the visual presentation is great. I loved those parts where I could tell what you were doing between transitions. You would go back and forth. And it was almost like the first time it happened, you would go and you'd see a transition and you'd walk and then you'd slow down and stop. And I was like, oh, and you'd go back. And I was like, I know Mike is looking at the screen being like, what? And just transition back and forth, and you see the double frame layers, and you see the 3 or the masking and how poor it is. I saw all that stuff.
Yeah.
And okay. That game is very fascinating, though. I watched up to the toy box, I think. So quite a bit for just watching it,
Oh, all the way up to the first toy box, the mini toy box. Okay, yeah, that's pretty far. The second one. The second one.
Yeah.
So you went through the forest, because the forest was where I saw the worst of the masking. Yeah.
Exactly, because those trees, and I'm looking at it, I'm like, trees are hard to mask. It's true.
It's just an effort issue. It's just an effort. It just takes more.
There's ways to do it. They just chose not to do it, right?
Yeah.
But so the story is very average. But there's some very compelling aspects of that game. But like I did ultimately decide that I was just gonna stop watching.
Yeah.
But it's got some cool elements. It's fun. It's an interesting game, interesting concept. But I do like the little dungeon or whatever you call it, the thing where it saves up your random encounters and you fight them all.
What is it? Dimension or something like that?
Yeah, Dimension something. That's a new idea that I always like it when RPGs can still innovate to some degree or another, and I thought that was pretty cool. It's a cool game, it really is. It's just it just looks, it's a little too cheaply done, I think, in some ways.
Yeah, so I was going to do a video on this, We went through a process of rebranding our channel a couple years ago. And what we ultimately landed on as our brand promise for Resonant Arc is deepening appreciation. If whatever we did, the goal of it was to deepen someone's appreciation for that thing we were talking about. That's what we kind of landed on as being what we felt like people subscribed for, what they wanted from us, and what our content usually did best. When it was performing at its best, it was usually because it was doing that, right?
Yeah. And if we can't do that, then
we shouldn't make the thing.
then don't do it. Yeah. So
this is the reason why I decided against doing a video on Fantasian. Now everybody here knows that I'm a massive fan of Hironobu Sakaguchi's work, and that I credit largely the problems with modern Final Fantasy with his departure from Square, and that I prefer his game design philosophy over those who are in charge at Square now. This does not mean that I like everything he's ever made. I do not like The Spirits Within. I do not like Blue Dragon. And I ultimately did not like Fantasian, even though I really liked Lost Odyssey, despite it having some problems here and there. And I really liked The Last Story. I did not like Fantasian. And it's hard to explain why, because this is a little bit of me being a victim of my own expectations. I have high expectations of that man. Like, he has created some of the most long-lasting formative experiences of my lifetime. Like, just games I will never forget. Games I will replay till the day I die, whenever that is. And to me are some of the most valuable pieces of art I've ever interacted with. So yes, I have high expectations of anything that he does. So I think it's fair to say that what Kaysen said is accurate. This is a good game. And it is really interesting, a lot of the things that they did. And when it comes to some of the gameplay ideas like the Dimension and like the kind of the little arcing aiming system with the combat, where you can aim your abilities to hit multiple enemies, and with magic you can kind of like arc it so that it like moves along like almost like a semicircle and like arcs and hits a bunch of enemies. There's some cool ideas there. I think that it's in many ways a very competently made game. And when I was thinking about what am I going to say in this video, right? Originally, I looked back to the little preview sort of review I did for Bravely Default 2. And I remember going through the comments of that video, and I was shocked, really shocked, to find so many people saying, I can't do it with these character models. I just hate the way they look so much that I cannot bring myself to play this game. The little plasticky kind of look to the character models, right? Yeah. Like, why did they do this? It ruins the game for me. And I was sitting there going, it's one of those things where like one man's nitpick is another man's like deal breaker, right? That was a deal breaker for people, and it was hard for me to understand how that's possible. Like how you couldn't look past something like the texture of the character models to enjoy, what the game has underneath that. Even for me, a lot of times, deal breaker would be not having a compelling story. And for me, Bravely Default 2 does not have a compelling story, but it was not a deal breaker because of these other things that were done so well. And that's kind of rare for me, right? So what I'm about to say about Fantasian is going to seem to many people like enormous nitpicks, like something that's not important or shouldn't be. Let me check something here real quick. I think I lost Kaysen.
Oh, did you?
No, you're back. You're back. Okay.
I just didn't move.
It was holding really still. I thought it had frozen. Okay. So it's going to sound like huge nitpicks to people, but there's somebody, a good friend of mine, viewer of the channel, who I've had tons of conversations with. He's a very big fan of Fantasian. He loves Fantasian. And he was one of those people who also said he couldn't bring himself to play Bravely Default because he hates the character models. I think the words he used were it was offensive to his eyes to look at those character models. He thought it clashed so much and he just couldn't play it. This is how I felt about the way they integrated those really brilliant, beautiful dioramas that they built. They went through such enormous effort and detail and hard work and beautiful artistry to create those physical dioramas. And I am basing this only right now. I am only basing this on sort of vague statements made in interviews in conjunction with my experience as a visual effects artist, right? So another friend of mine, Night Sky Prince, is going to be interviewing Hironobu Sakaguchi this week, and I asked him if he would ask this question for me, in behalf of me, so that I would know for sure if this is the truth before I talk about it in any sort of public way, right? But what you are looking at, and when you're playing Fantasian, as far as I can see, is not a physical photograph. It is not a photograph of a physical object you are looking at. What they did is they photo scanned the dioramas. So photo scanning is where you create a 3D model by taking hundreds of pictures all around the object. We did this a couple of times for some of our videos on our earlier channel, Dark Pixel, before we moved over to this channel. We created 3D models of me that we used ragdoll physics on to kind of throw around. We just took a bunch of pictures of me from a bunch of different angles and created this crude sort of 3D model out of it. So this is a technique that's been around for a little while now, maybe around about a decade. And it's getting better and better all the time. You should see some of the photo scans they can do on people now where it's just like, holy crap, that looks like a real person. Because the detail that they're capturing in these photo scans and the geometry that they can, the number of polygons that you can put into 3D models now is pretty ridiculous. And you can render these things much faster. But the point is that they took hundreds and hundreds of images all around these diorama sets that they built, and they created 3D models out of them. Then what they did is they would pick their angle that they wanted the background to be, and they would take a photograph of the house or the tree or the environment, and they would grab the texture from that image, and they would then project that texture onto the 3D model that they had created by photo scanning. That is what you are seeing. It is not the photograph of the physical object itself. And to me, to my eye, I could tell by looking at it, I was not looking at a physical object. I was looking at a projection map on a 3D model, which to me defeated the purpose altogether. Now, here is the reason why I would have assumed they would do it that way. Back in the day, when they did I said this was going to be a quick answer, now it's turning into a freaking rant. I was not planning on going into this, but now I feel like I have to. I've committed. So when they would do in Final Fantasy 7 or 8 or 9, their, what do you call them? Pre-rendered backgrounds, right? And the models will be running around on them. They just had little contact shadows underneath the characters, a little circular, like black feathered solid that would sort of like, that they used to sort of give the illusion of a contact shadow for the character running around. There was not any kind of real-time lighting that was like casting a digital shadow right onto those environments, because it wouldn't have worked, because shadows interact with geometry. So if I'm standing next to a building and the sun is hitting me, it's going to cast up the wall, right? But if I stand further away from the wall, the shadow will move until it comes off of the wall and it's just being kept, like protracted along the ground before it comes in contact with the wall. So the closer I get to the wall, my shadow will move up the wall, right? Or over a rock, or over a hillside, or over a person when I cross in front of a person.
You would have to 3D map the environment. That's how
exactly.
they do it in the movies.
In order for real-time lighting to work, you have to have geometry for the shadow to be casted on, otherwise it will not look right. So that's the reason why in the PlayStation Final Fantasy games, they just used circular contact shadows. That I would understand the need to photo scan the dioramas if the plan was that they were going to use real-time lighting to try to blend the models into these environments, to try to make them look like they're a part of the scene, right? They didn't do that. They went with circular contact shadows, which is not necessarily the worst choice they could have made. But here's where it becomes, as I'm calling it, offensive to my eyes. The post-production compositing work in Fantasian is, in my opinion, awful. It's not just average, it's very far below average. And it absolutely does a disservice to the brilliant work that went into building those sets, because those are beautiful. And in some instances,
Forest especially,
yeah, when you're indoors and you're like really close up, that projection mapping technique comes across so well that it almost looks like it is actually the physical photograph of the real thing. For a lot of the wider shots of the larger areas, not so much. And any times it gets like really close to the characters, some of the backgrounds are very fuzzy. There's a flower field in particular during the forest that is so blurry. It's just like, what on earth, man? Like that's supposed to be the whole point of doing a pre-rendered background or a single image background, is that you don't have to render all this geometry and stuff, so it shouldn't be a problem to have a very high resolution. So I just didn't get why they were so low res. Now, part of this was because I was playing on an Apple TV, and what I've heard is that that's actually the worst platform to play it on. It would be better to do one on like an iMac or something like that, or one of like the newer iPhones with higher processing power that they apparently do have the backgrounds at a higher resolution on those platforms. So that's part of it. Now, the contact shadows of the characters are like twice as wide as the character is themselves, which is like rule number one of creating a believable contact shadow. You can't make the circle wider than the hips of the person, which is usually the wide, or shoulders, which is the widest point of the person, right? But I mean, even for the little birds, they're like contact shadows are like as wide as the person, but the person's is twice as wide as the person's shoulders and hips. And it's just, it looks so bad to me. Wow. It looks so bad. It totally ruins the illusion and comes so short of the whole selling concept of the game. Like the first thing you'll ever hear in the marketing of Fantasian is, we built 150 something original dioramas, and this is so beautiful, and this is such a unique way of designing a world. And then we completely fail the idea by having such subpar compositing work. Whoever was in charge of taking the character and blending the character into the environment did an awful job. So it's not just contact shadows, it's masking too, where, again, sometimes you're going to have foreground elements. This tree is supposed to be in the foreground, and so the character needs to be able to move behind that tree. But we have a still image. So what you have to do is you have to duplicate that image, and you have to cut out or mask the foreground element so that it's now in a layer that's on top, and then you put the character in between the two, right? Now, that's how it would work in a layer sort of structure like Adobe's, how would you call it? I know that there's like nodal types of compositors that are different.
Games would do that, but this game, if you're dealing with photographs, photographs are 2D. So you basically have to do the layer
You have
thing.
to do
You can't
layering,
do it
right? So,
yeah.
like I said, this is not a problem that's just exclusive to one area. I noticed this masking problem freaking all the time, and it's hard. Like Kaysen said, it's really hard to do this on trees and bushes that have all of these protrusions and small little details that you'd have to draw around.
Rough edges, transparency.
Yeah, and I have always taken a lot of pride in my masking work because I usually will go the extra 20 miles in zooming very far in and drawing very meticulous masks around things. Because that's just something that's important to me. It's like if your masking doesn't look right, it's going to fail the shot. It's going to fail the immersion of the audience. Your masking has to be done right. And if I were working on that game, I would have done the hard work of masking out all those little tiny leaves and little details to make sure that the mask is as close to perfectly accurate as possible. Of course, it can't be perfect, but as close as you can get. Now, when I say that the effort that went into some of these masks is abysmal, I'm not exaggerating. They didn't even try to do that. It's like let's say I'm gonna I'm gonna hand trace or air trace some geometry here. Let's say there's a flat ground here, and then there's a bush that, let's just say my head is like where the bush is at, right? And then it kind of comes down to this side again. And then let's say that my pop filter here in the foreground is like a tree or something. So we have my head and this pop filter are things that the character needs to be able to pass behind, so we didn't mask it. What I would do is I would zoom in and I would get, you see all this craziness with my hair? All these strands I'd have to cut. I have to cut that one out and I have to do a little curve there and I have to cut and just be very meticulous. And probably have 200 points of the mask that I create around my head. And then I come over this, and this is way easier. I don't have to create as many of that. That's a very smooth surface, right? So that's going to be easier to draw. What they did in Fantasian is 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, 0.6, call it done. I'm done now. So that when I run behind that
was
it's
hard work.
It's cutting, it's just so bad, dude. Oh, it's so bad. And it's not even just trees and bushes, which are hard that they failed to do this on. It's light posts inside of towns. It's like a barrel inside of a house. It's like some snow on the outside of like a building. it's just all the time. And it's so poorly done, and it just really, really offends my eyes. And it does a disservice to the work that was done on the dioramas. So I really hated that. That was one thing. So the visuals, which was like the big selling point, was a failure to me. And I think if they were just going to do contact shadows, they should have been done right. They should have been much smaller. And they should have just used the photographs of the physical dioramas. They should not have done projection mapping if this was going to be the end result. It would have looked way better. Okay, so that's that.
I think another reason why they did it as well, there are a couple, the transitions when they're going from shot to shot. I did like that they did that because sometimes you're playing these old, these old games with the stationary camera. And when you go into a new room, you don't know where you entered the screen at when it goes to a new shot.
Yes.
You don't know where you are. It kind of takes a minute. Every time you have to reorient yourself. But you don't have to do that in Fantasian because you see the camera moving to the new spot. You see everything and you know where you were relative to that. So it's cool to be able to see that move. And I think having their 3D scan helped them to do that move. Problem being, there's still the texture render elements that you mentioned are being projection mapped on. Those are not animating the way that the camera is moving around certain objects. Those
are just
crossfading
them.
Yeah, like a crossfade, just like they're just blending in from one shot to the other. And at that point, you may as well just be using a photo if that's what you're going to do.
Yeah.
Because even though you do get some dynamics with the 3D scene, the way that the other texture fades on to the new map, right? The new model it's being projected onto, it makes it just looks bad, and you can tell in the transition that they didn't do it properly. But one reason I think that this may be the reason why they decided to not go with the photos is because there's certain places that you go that are technically behind other things, behind other buildings, but the camera is seeing through the building, right?
Yeah.
And that's hard to do. You'd have to move that building for that to take that picture, from that angle.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they could have worked around that instead of doing what they did.
Yeah.
Because at that point you may as well just 3D model and just do it all in CG.
Exactly. It's like, yes.
Yeah.
And that's been some of the kickback that I've gotten for voicing a few of these criticisms to people. It's like, well, it would have taken this much extra effort to have done it that way or whatever. And it's like, okay, then we're coming to the point of the criticism, which is if doing it this way, if building the physical dioramas is like the goal, and it's going to make the end result look worse than just creating 3D models, and it's going to be that much harder to do it, then if you can't end up delivering on the promise of this idea, then you shouldn't do it, is my opinion.
So what happened here, as far as I can tell, is you're bowling, you knock down 8 pins, but you have a 7-10 split, right? You got the 2 back, right, and left pins.
Yeah.
And it's like, you know, it's like 1 in a million to convert a 7-10 split. You just pick one, go after one of them. You're not going to get both in all likelihood. But every now and then people think, oh, I could get both. I'll bet you I could get both, right? So the 7-pin is really, creating the miniatures and taking pictures. The 10-pin is just doing it all CG. And what you end up doing when you try to just do both, where it's like, oh, but maybe we'll do a little CG with our miniatures. And that's what they did, right? They bowled the 7-10 split right down the middle and they missed both pins. And that's what happens when you try to hit both sides of that. Like, they're different. And the only way you can't do it that way. You just can't do it that way.
Yeah.
Did you ever see how they did Kubo and the 2 strings?
No.
Did you ever watch that movie?
I've never seen it.
So it's claymation, right? So it's similar kind of thing, miniatures and all that kind of stuff. But they didn't want to do any CG, and they did some compositing. There is some like 2D compositing. But what they did after they were done with their models, they slid this like green screen or blue screen, like a card, at multiple different distances.
Crap.
Up until right immediately behind the character that was there, that was being filmed. And so they were able to separate all of these different layers going back and forward because they were able to kind of slide this card in between each shot. And that gave them the freedom in compositing. I feel like something like that with a blue screen or a blue card could have been done on location if they were using these photos. And you just, okay, these will be hard to mask. Okay, where does the character go? Okay, here, let's do blue card here. Okay, blue card here, blue card here. Now you just key and you've got your mask. You don't need to do any of that.
That's true.
Anyways, I don't know how much longer I'm going to talk about that, but there's a lot they could have done.
There's a lot of solutions, and there's also a very valid point to be made that 2020 was a pandemic, and they probably didn't have the ability to develop the game the way they wanted to, and probably pressured to rush it out this year to try to get Apple Arcade to get some people to actually use it. And like there's certainly going to be reasons why maybe they couldn't go all the way through with the idea or something. I don't know all the details behind the scenes. All I know is what I'm looking at as a final result, and it is not what it claims to be. I'm not looking at physical dioramas when I'm playing the game, and it seems to be for no reason, because if they were doing projection mapping, I would assume the reason would be so they could have shadows, but they don't have shadows. They have really bad contact shadows. So they might as well just have used
cycle, like other lighting things.
Right. That would be the only reason to do that. That would be the only reason to do that, because you are converting a physical object you built with your hands into a digital one, and that makes no sense. Because the whole selling point was that they were physically real backgrounds, but they aren't when you're looking at them in the game. So The only reason to do that is so that your character doesn't have to have a contact shadow and can blend in better, but they all have contact shadows, and the contact shadows are the worst possible contact shadows you could even make. Okay, so that's that. Separate issue, story. I expected something a little more, I don't want to say original. Tropes are a part of RPGs, right? They're part of everything. Everything, no matter what genre it is, has its tropes. To me, it's about what you do with it that kind of makes it your own or does have a unique spin on it. I think the greatest example of this in gaming and in RPGs is the amnesiac protagonist, right? Like, that's so common that it's just like a part of the genre at this point. It's just like every freaking game has an amnesiac protagonist, almost, it seems like.
Because it enables the tutorial section to be less, like, obviously weird, because it's like, you should already know this, you know?
Yeah, and also you can hide the mysteries. It's more convenient to the plot to hide the mysteries when the character should know something.
Is, who am I, right?
Yes.
So,
so the plot of Fantasian is this character trying to figure out what was I doing here in the first scene. So in the first scene, in that futuristic sort of robot world or whatever that you were talking about, Leo loses his memory. And so the rest of the game is him trying to find out what he was doing there, right? Like, what was it that I was doing in that place? And so I can go do it now. Okay. What I was going to say is that Xenogears is a great example of a game that takes the amnesiac protagonist trope, but does something so unique with it, and something so like almost like the way that they introduce his multiple personalities and some of his like repressed memories and like the psychology of it is like extremely convincing. It's like, it's not just, oh, I hit my head and now I have retrograde amnesia, which almost never happens in real life.
It's so rare. Yeah, it's crazy.
Almost never happens. Like it's just not the way that amnesia generally works. Yeah. So it feels like falling on a trope for plot convenience sake. But the problem for me is that you don't need to do it in Fantasian. I don't think Fantasian's plot it necessitates the protagonist being an amnesiac. I think you could have hidden all of those same secrets and revealed them in the same way, and the plot could have gone more or less the same direction without Leo being an amnesiac protagonist. You just have him discovering these things for the first time instead of him having already discovered them, then lost his memory of them, and then discover them again as he goes back to the toy boxes and tries to spark his memory, right? Like, you just have him following clues left behind by his father and discovering these things for the first time, and you can have the plot almost progress exactly the same way. Now, that goes, of course, without saying that there are going to be certain things you'd have to tweak a little bit. Kind of like when we talked about FF8, if you start the game in the Dalit mission, you're going to have to exposit a couple of extra things for it to make sense. You'll have to tweak it a bit. But I don't think there's any sort of major changes you'd have to make to Fantasian's plot in order for you to take away the amnesiac protagonist trope and have it sort of proceed in more or less the same way. But we've talked about this forever. I didn't enjoy the story that much, and there's other reasons why that I may or may not talk about later. But I think you can see from this last probably 30 minutes or 40 minutes we've spent talking about Fantasian, the reason why we don't do this on the public channel, because this is not what you expect from us. You don't expect us to tear something apart. It's about, how can I gain more appreciation for that thing? And that's why I didn't make a video on it. Okay, last question, then we're gonna wrap up on this one.
Okay.
This comes from Bento. I recently read the old 2009 FF7 review from Action Button. He has a link here. It talks about games being about something, and it got me thinking about the types of games I've been playing lately and the ones I've enjoyed more. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Many indie games seem to be going down that route with different levels of success, while I, anecdotally, see less of that on higher production games for some reason. How important is it for a game to be about something? Is it a prerequisite for a good story-based game? Or can you have a good story that's not technically about anything? I tried to think about this and see if there was any sort of like devil's advocate I could play with myself on it, because my instinct is to say that, like, well, a non-story based game can easily just be about having fun, right? And I think what he means by is it about something is, does the story have a theme, right?
Right. Like, what's Mario Brothers about? What's Splatoon about?
Yeah. Those games don't need to be about something, right?
No, they don't.
But a story-based game, where I would generally say yes, because stories have themes and are trying to say something generally, right? That's my instinct. Now I'm trying to like play devil's advocate with myself and be like, well, what if what it's trying to say is that you don't have to write a story about something in order for it to be meaningful? But that still is kind of saying something, right? The story still is about something, even if it's about the fact that you don't need to always have it be about something, that you can just, and life doesn't have to be so analytically approached or something like that. Yeah. That I would still classify as the story being about something, right? It still like has a message it's trying to get across to you. And so I think story-based games do need to be about something. Otherwise, what's the point? I mean, what is a story if it's not about something? It's not really a story, right? Like, if a story doesn't have conflict, if it doesn't have a goal, if it doesn't have something that you're working toward or something the character's trying to change, like, then is it a story? Or I mean, it's hard to say that it's really a story if it doesn't have those things. It's kind of like what a story is.
Yeah, it can't be a story. It can be, you can have a series of events.
Yes.
You can have a general observation of disconnected things, right? Yeah. Like sometimes, so I have two kids. So I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And when I tell my 3-year-old a story at night, because I tell him both stories every night, the story is very thematic. It's very centered on things happening, right?
Yeah.
But when my son, who can't hardly say a word, he's almost 2. He still can't talk, by the way. I think he says a little bit, but he just doesn't care about
kids are talking. Different. Yeah. Some of them don't care about it.
My daughter was blabbing on at like 10 months old, and my son's 22, 23 months almost. And he's like, doesn't care to talk. So the stories I tell him are so different. It's just, I just tell him facts about the world. Like I just say, there's a horse, and the horse says neigh, and the horse likes to run. The horse has so much fun running in the fields, and sometimes there's cows and foxes. And I just tell him things. It's not a story. And then I just tell him horses eat hay, and then they go home and they go to sleep, and the end. And he goes the end back, and it's like he thinks that's a story. There's no meaning to it whatsoever. Mm-hmm. It's just a series of events. It's just life. This is how some parts of the world work. That would sort of be like an about nothing thing. I can't think of a game equivalent of that. That's as close as I can get to sort of telling a story. But what you're really doing is just explaining how horses work.
Yeah.
And it's not really about anything, right? That's as close as I can get to that. But I don't know of any examples other than the one I just told. Even documentaries are about stuff, like,
I mean, you could get into avant-garde and like art films and
yes.
that sort of thing where it's trying really hard
like
to be unconventional.
Like a music video where it's just kind of crazy. Yeah.
But I think even still, it's like there's still an intention to the sort of chaotic or unconventional structure of it. It's like there's still something that they're trying to express as an artist through that art. Even if it is, the point is to try to like make you think hard about it when it really isn't about anything. Like there's still something but that the person thought about when they made that thing that is outside of just, hey, because I'm trying to think, like, yeah, Mario Brothers isn't about anything. It's goal-oriented. It's a game in the same way that chess is a game. It's like you have a goal.
It's not about, yeah.
You have rules and goals, and that's not a story. This was like Roger Ebert's biggest reason why he thought video games weren't art, is because he figured they're for the same reason that basketball is not an art, because it's a game, right? But that's just not the case with story-based games. Like story-based games are about something, which is what makes them art, right? So, yeah,
What would a game be that's not about something? I just can't. I think I need a more concrete example.
that'd be,
The
maybe we should
closest
read,
I can get is something like a farming simulator
yeah,
or like Sim City.
or
It's still
emergent
about it.
storytelling where it's like you kind of make your own story by
Yeah, like
going
yeah,
around doing what you do. But like the game itself is not necessarily like dictating something to you. Like
yeah,
Minecraft or
like
um,
Minecraft.
even in a lot of ways like Breath of the Wild or something. Like some of my favorite parts of Breath of the Wild
Sure.
were the stories I made in my unique experience of exploring that world.
Yeah, as you come across different things, and that's different for everybody.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm not excited about Breath of the Wild 2 possibly using the exact same map again, as has been hinted,
Yeah, that was
because
interesting. I was not expecting that.
Aonuma said that you'll be returning to the same Hyrule. And I'm like, well, I don't know that it's for sure, but this was years ago, a year or two ago. Um, they're gonna do different things to it, but at the same time, it's like, well, that I've already explored that Hyrule. The game's all about exploration. I already explored it, so
Yeah,
what's it
what's the
about now?
point?
And even then, what did I just say? I just said the game's about exploration.
Mm-hmm.
Even a game that where all you do is explore and there is no story, it's about
Something.
something. I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard
But
to
you know,
it's
there's
hard
the
to
idea with like Seinfeld is a show about nothing, and that's more or less true, but not completely.
I mean, it's like each individual episode is about something.
Yes, that is
Like,
true. Every episode is definitely about something. The show, it's hard to pinpoint what the show's about, but each episode definitely has a theme and some arc that
yeah,
happens.
something that it's.
Yeah.
Anyways, it's hard.
Remember
Yeah, I maybe in the review, the action button review, he clarifies like what he means about a game that's not about something. But I would say it's hard to think of an example of anything that's not about something.
yeah.
Like it's really hard to think of an example.
Because then you kind of I tie the about with like purpose. Like, what's the purpose of this thing?
Yeah, yeah,
And a game where there is no purpose, there is no point. Um, those are the games that don't get made.
yeah,
So, um, anyways, yeah, I'm sure there's something. You know, I'm sure maybe we're overthinking it too. It could be
yeah. It's
that
very
he
high
doesn't mean it
possibility.
quite like that. Just it's about less than a serious hardcore linear story, you know.
Yeah,
In the case of Minecraft or Breath of the Wild, then those are great examples. Games can be that, and those games will tend to be the ones that you can play for 500 hours, you know,
right.
because there is no point, there is no purpose, which means when you're done is when are you just decide that you're not going to keep playing it. There is no point, there's no purpose, which means there's no ending, which means there's no goal. And you know, so Breath of the Wild wouldn't fit there. Even Minecraft has a story sort of ish mode, right? Do you not have to play the story mode though, right? You can
No, you
just
don't. And
you
that
can just
mean
playground it up.
when something is truly about nothing, I mean, as far as I can tell, that's kind of the definition of boredom, right? Is like not having a goal, not having something that is occupying your mind or some sort of problem you're working on or thing you're trying to figure out or
Yeah.
it's like when there's truly nothing in it. I feel like that's kind of counterintuitive to what people seek for.
Which is why in a game like Minecraft, you end up making your own purpose. You end up
Yeah,
making your own rules. You end up making your own meaning, story, whatever, what have you. What's the
sure.
word? The
Emergent
word is
storytelling.
yeah, but the word that we're trying to find, the about. You
Oh,
end up making it about something, even though the game technically would not necessarily be about anything.
yeah,
Your mind, you're right, it would just be pure boredom. So your mind forces it to be about something,
yeah,
and that's interesting. I mean that's you know I think more games, especially with like procedural technology and stuff, we will see more games that are just about having a different. That's what it's about. It's just it's different every time, and so it's
yeah.
not thematically about anything, but it's just procedurally different, and you make it about whatever you want to make it about.
Yep.
I wouldn't love games like that, but some people might a lot.
Well, I mean, it can
Because
be.
endless possibilities.
Can be fun. Oh, he has a PS here. I don't know if you guys have played it or not, but now that Disco Elysium Final Cut is out, yay for voice acting, would you consider putting on a list of games to analyze in the future? Disco Elysium is
Never heard of it.
a game I've heard about, but I haven't heard a lot about it. But it's like a... No, I'm not going to try to describe it. It's an RPG, but it's like it's a really interesting setting. It's kind of like almost like a noir. That might not even be right. Anyways, it's got an interesting setting to it, and it's got kind of that almost top-down isometric view, maybe something akin to like Baldur's Gate or something, kind of in that realm or that genre. Anyway, it's a game I do want to look at. I don't know when that will happen, but I would really like to play it someday. So we'll see. One of these days, we're basically going to have to force our audience to choose something that is not made in Japan. we're gonna have to force the choice on them by like not including a Nihon game on our freaking polls. But
so that we can get Mass Effect or something like that.
Yeah, I just don't know if anyone will watch it when we do it. Is the problem? It's.
I mean, that's true. That's a fair point. Our audience is a bunch of weebs.
Just a bunch of weebs, dude. Too many weebs. Anyways, we appreciate you guys. Thank you for your support on Patreon, Subscribe Star. You guys make it possible.
I apologize for calling you all weebs, but
Well, I mean, it's just
facts
a fact.
are what they are.
It's just a fact.
It's just a fact.
But we appreciate you guys. Thank you. And we will be back with you again soon for more Nier. I got the remastered edition.
Sick.
And I have not played it yet, but I plan to. Problem is that I'm doing so much traveling for work. So I was in Kansas last week. I'm going to be in Phoenix this weekend. I'm going to be in Vegas all next week. So it's like I'm doing all this traveling, filming and stuff. And so I just had not had a chance to sit down and play it. But I will be done traveling for a while when I get back from Vegas. So I'm going to, first thing I do that weekend is just like dedicate it to Nier Replicant Remastered. And beat the ending A of both versions, and then we'll start working on the next podcast.
Cool.
Anyways, till then,
all right, guys.
have a good one, everyone. Peace out.